This is your host, Shylo, and you are tuning in to Grit and Grace. Real people, real conversations, and real grit. Generational trauma, verbal abuse, and how to break the chains. I'm Shylo, and this is Grit and Grace. So a lot has been on my heart lately, and generational trauma gets brought up a lot when we're talking on this podcast, when we're talking in, special groups or rooms, wherever you're at, social media wise, or, having private conversations. And some of the conversations that have been brought up a lot is generational trauma within, obviously, your families when it comes to cycles and things that you go through. My personal story, if you have not heard it, my first episode really dives in pretty deep into it in a really good condensed way. So I recommend you check out that first podcast. But, this is a tough one for me to do. I chose to do it alone because I know that a lot of people are not comfortable sharing this type of stuff because they have family. They want to protect it. I also have family and I want to respect a lot of people in my family, but it's time to talk about some things. I've been very open about my alcoholism in my family, my struggle with alcohol, and, working on that daily, of being sober. I love it. Alcohol free, proud of it. I'm excited. Every day is a new day because I'm experiencing it sober for the first time since I've been 15. And I think that's incredible. And, if anyone is listening or watching, you can always reach out to me if you would like some information or you need help or you want support, whatever it is, I can try to guide you. And I'm always here to help. I chose to talk a little bit about the family and generational traumas and abuse because it definitely runs in my own. And within the women of our family, we have experienced a lot of verbal trauma and abuse. And, this isn't knocking anyone. I have had a beautiful grandma and grandpa who, showed us many amazing things. And they had a lot of struggles. My grandpa came from the Depression and my grandma, they raised their own brothers and sisters. They put themselves through school. My grandma did. She was a nurse. She was incredible. She was a saint and just a beautiful woman. My grandpa was a hard worker, incredible. And I don't think he made it past, sixth grade. I can't remember. Taught himself to read and put himself through work and raised a beautiful family. And I think, we look at some of these times and these people were under immense stress, trauma, and pressure. Some of the things they dealt with are things we in this time have never dealt with. So I want to preface this and say, in no way am I making an excuse, but I also think environment and time and what people have gone through will create some of these traumas. And I think it's 100% true. And I see that in what I'm going to address. My grandpa was more of a verbal, he would yell a lot. I'm not sure if my grandma did, but my grandpa was the yeller. I developed this too. Like I have been a yeller in my life and I have sarcasm. That comes from my dad's side. So sarcasm is not a good thing. It's funny sometimes, but we're really using it to cut people. It's to tear the flesh. Sarcasmo means to tear the flesh. And it really does. Like think about when people are passive aggressive or sarcastic to you, like that's tearing. And you remember those things. What's funny is I have comments or people have said things to me even in high school. I still remember. That's wild. Like, hello, let's heal it. So let's talk about healing too. I'm going to try to bring light to some of this because it's not something that needs to be kept in the dark. If there's verbal abuse in your life and your family, don't treat it as it should be kept in a box in the dark because it should be talked about. There's no reason you can't have these discussions. Now, if you are in a dangerous relationship, I do not recommend addressing this in those situations. I recommend having a mediator, a counselor, a priest, whatever you're comfortable with. And there's not a dangerous situation. So I want to say that before we get into it. But throughout my life, I have witnessed some really tough verbal abuse towards my mother for almost her entire life with her spouses or boyfriends. And she had even was in a physically abusive relationship at one time. And that was devastating. I wasn't around for that one, but you don't forget that. And when you're abused, you create ways to survive, and you create like mechanisms to get through it, and you pass it to your children. Now, I'm not blaming my mother. This was passed to her. And I'm not blaming my grandmother or anyone, because I don't know what it was like to be in the Depression. I don't know what it was like to raise 6 or more children at the age of 12. I don't know what it was like to have no money and barely be able to eat. I don't know. I don't know what it's like to go to war and lose everyone and be the only one left. My grandpa did that. And a lot of that anger would come out. So I never saw my grandpa in that light, just FYI. And I want to say that lovingly, because he was a wonderful man. He was a beautiful man. He was one of my favorite people in my life. And he did help me create a sense, not only a sense of self, but responsibility and faith. My grandma and grandpa were very religious. They were very faithful, and they instilled in me things that I'll never replace with anything else. Like, they created such good things in me. So I want to be mindful of that. But when you're a child of trauma or abuse, you work so hard sometimes at trying not to be a child of trauma and abuse and go into that sometimes you end up in it. Because you're working so hard to not be like someone else. And this is something I've done. So I'm sharing my own personal experience. I worked so hard to try to not be in relationships like my mother that I wound up doing some of the things that put me in bad situations. I was lying about things. I started to cope and deal with things in the wrong way, which create a lot of problems. Like, I started when I was in my beginning of my marriage, my second marriage, I would cope and do things that I would never have done because I started to shelter myself. If I was being approached poorly, or if I felt like I was being spoken to poorly, I would retreat. And what would happen is I would retreat into myself, and I still have to watch this. And I would lie about little things like going and get coffees because I wanted to avoid the conflict. I was so scared of being yelled at that I was creating more problems. So that's on me, where I was doing things where it was like, oh my gosh. And I wouldn't say that my husband was a yeller. I think the words itself started to break at me. And words will cut you over time. They don't have to be yelling. They don't have to be, screaming at the top of your lungs to be hurtful. We can say things sarcastically or little things here and there. And I think over time, I was allowing many things. I also verbally probably abused my first daughter. I didn't know how to handle her. I've been open about that. Like, I screamed. That's a form of verbal hurt, right? And so I had to work on my sarcasm with her. I had to work on my yelling. And it's something I still work on, and I think I've gotten incredibly better. Plus, when you're not drinking, plus when you don't add all the things, it is easier. Stress, things like that. But I do want to bring this to the light because I think this can be a light focused conversation. I think we can have this conversation. And yes, I deal with some of these issues currently, but have I healed many issues with my family? Yes. We are here in this time to heal these things, and we can. We have a gift that's been given to us. We are at the right time, at the right moment. We have the right tools. We have the right training and guidance that we can heal these things and end them. So our children can heal with us and not do what we did, right? And so I own that I have been very sarcastic and verbal and cut and done that. My first marriage, I did it just as much. It was my zinger. I wanted to get back. That was my way of fighting, was to be sarcastic and get angry. And I used to scream. And I ended up hating myself for it. I didn't want my daughter to see that. And, it's something that we've worked on for a few years now, and it's definitely something to fix. But for people who are experiencing abuse and people who are experiencing verbal abuse, what I want you to say or to think about and hear is that it's not okay, no matter what it is and who it is. And you may be doing it as well. And just know that even though it's not okay, we can fix it. So I'm not going to criticize anyone because some of the best people in the world use their words out of anger and hurt, and they don't even know that they could be causing permanent damage because that's what they've experienced. And so I want to bring this message to a lot of women, because of women, it happens to men. I know men who have been physically abused. I know men get verbally abused as well. It's not one-sided. So I don't want to come off saying that it's only women that get verbally abused, because it's not. It's not. Women can tear just as hard as men with their words. And so if you're in a physically abusive relationship, please get help, find help. If you need help, reach out. I don't want you to be in a dangerous situation. When it comes to the verbal, I know for me that there are things that tore me to pieces, that would tear me down. And sometimes when we're verbally, like, consistently talked down to, or the words, or constantly cutting our personalities, or serious things, our character. Like, it's different when someone says, you're being a sway, and maybe you are, or maybe you aren't, and you can have a conversation. Great. But when someone tells you, well, you're this, and you're this, and you're this, and they say it over and over, it will eat at you and tear you apart. Words will tear you to shreds. And I see a lot of women who lose their self-worth. I was one of them. I have lost my self-worth in my life multiple times. I even dated people who would say horrific things to me. And they would put me in a place where I felt like I didn't want to live. And I'm not blaming them only, but I would get so torn down, I'd have to build myself back up. And you have to come to a point where you know that these words are not true. You have to come to a point where you know that the person saying something like that to you is hurting. And when you can come to the place of forgiveness and understanding, the words do not cut any longer. And it's very easy for me to say when I've been healing through it, working through it, and at a different place in my life. But I'm telling you, there is a way to heal this. And I'm telling you that there is a way to do this. And it really comes into understanding and forgiveness. And for me, looking at my mother's relationships and some of the women in my life's relationships, and kind of seeing the years of watching sadness and hurt and sometimes very traumatic situations, and saying always, like, that's never going to be me. Well, that's not true. I've put myself in those situations. I've created situations. When I drank, I was not a nice person towards the end. I would get very reactive, so I didn't add to any of this. And when you mix these things and people who are hurting and dealing with traumas and childhood traumas and years of verbal abuse and years of sarcasm. And I'm telling you what, sarcasm is one of the worst. When passive aggressive, and when you have, this is their coping and this is what they know, they need to learn to undo it. And it's a process. And that process can take a long time, y'all. And what I encourage is that even if you can't heal somebody else, because you can't, and if somebody is not willing to heal it, the best thing you can do for yourself is get with somebody, a professional, to talk about your issues, a therapist, a counselor, a healer, whatever your realm is, a pastor, a priest, whatever, and discuss you. and be willing to take on your part of it and own it. Because I'm not going to sit and say that I'm 100% a victim all the time. I have been just as guilty of, and this is through my whole life, lashing out, saying stuff back, being very harsh, very rude, very crude. I have a dry sense of humor. My sarcasm's high. I've had to work on these things. Even recently in the last year, I've really had to identify like, whoa, I need to hear other people. I used to put people down. So I had this conversation. This is a form of kind of abuse when you blow people's problems off and you say, it's nothing, get over it. I used to do that all the time because I couldn't identify that something I've never been through. They don't understand me, so their problems are nothing, right? I've been through my own traumas. They're mine. People have their own. And I couldn't identify with it. Therefore, I thought, get over it. It's not a big deal. I've said that. I've actually gotten in fights with people and I'm in the wrong. Dismissing someone's trauma is abusive in your own right. So we need to be mindful as humans to not dismiss people's traumas. Now, I don't think everyone wants to be a victim. They just want to be heard. I think that was something I had a hard time with because I felt like I wasn't heard. I was screaming and saying things out loud because I wasn't being heard. That's why a lot of people use words to tear other people down because they just want to be heard and they're not communicating properly and they can't get it out. So communication is key. I'm going to have a guest on in the next week or two all about communication and how we can identify personality types, how to talk to them and understand them. And I think that's so important. I mean, in business life, anything, this is going to heal these things. Working on your communication and your emotional intelligence. So we will be doing a show shortly. And I'm excited to announce that guest. Talking about those things, but all of this comes together in healing. And so we have this generational trauma. You know, for me, I had generational trauma with verbal abuse on both sides. My grandparents, my grandpa was abusive to my father. And we can talk about that because my father was open about it, but he physically abused my dad, not only physical, but very verbally abusive, was sarcastic, and was an alcoholic. And so my dad got a double whammy. I should say a triple whammy. He also lost his mother at a young age. So there was this perfect storm of shit for him. And I say that lovingly because my dad was very open and he shared a lot with me and was open with me. But it was hard for him. And so bringing that in, he worked so hard never to hurt me. Like, not that he ever hurt me. He never hit me. I think he spanked me once and felt terrible. He worked so hard not to be like his father. But these other things, these isms that he brought with him were the sarcasm and the passive aggressive. Like, he was the most sarcastic person ever. And his words hurt. Like, some of the words he had said to me for a long time stuck with me, the rough stuff. And he worked very hard on himself on that. But when you add alcohol to the mix, no matter how hard you work, that little devil comes out and it would take away everything he worked hard on. So it was a battle. And so my grandfather died of alcohol. My dad died of alcohol. And I come in and I'm like, no, I'm not dying of this. I'm not letting it do this to me. So there's a generational curse that I work on every day to make sure I don't go down the same path and that my children get to see the version of me that they need to see, a sober mother. And that's really important to me. And I want to show them that you can do anything and you don't need it. Now, my kids, if they choose to drink, fine. I have to let them do that. But I want them to see a healthy, sober version of their mother and see success from that and know that there is a way to live without alcohol, drugs, whatever. But again, that verbal piece has been in my life too on both sides. And when it came into my marriages, I was just as guilty. I was trying not to be, I'm trying to prevent this from happening, but I'm doing it, right? So I'm doing this too. And now I never considered myself to be verbal until I sat down and thought about it. And I'm like, yeah, maybe I am a little bit. And maybe I need to work on that. My reactions were bad, but then if you add alcohol, my reactions were terrible, right? So my words would come out and they'd be awful and they'd be cutting. And I caused a lot of issues with simple words, but they were jabs. And that was my way of being like, screw you, you know, like, I'm going to get you. And it still creeps up sometimes. I have to work on it. But you can only work on you when it comes to being with people who might be hurting you. Number one, if you have any friends that are cutting you or putting you down, you do not need them. I don't care if you're your best friends. You don't need friends like that. You need to put the boundaries up and say, hey, no, we can't do this. Nah, no friend is worth being abused. Anyone in your life, social media, you do not need that. Take them out. Delete them. I do not feel bad when I delete people on social media. I don't care. I don't even care if you're in my family. I don't care. If you're going to abuse me on social media, you're abusing me behind my back. You're abusing me. Like if not even abusive, shitty to me, gossiping, same thing. Gossip is abuse. Okay. Gossip is abusive. So you don't need that in your life either. Get rid of these people. You do not need them. But when it comes to maybe somebody who you love to death, maybe it's a spouse. This is something that if you're committed, if you're willing to be committed, you need to work on it with them. And you hope that they can identify this area of either anger or frustration, or many times it's like a child screaming for attention and love. And these are things that they have to work on. The hard part is they have to know that and identify that. And it's not an easy road. So for those who are in relationships who may need help, advice, number one, if you're in a dangerous relationship, you need to go find help and get out of it, out of the environment. First and foremost, make sure you have help and that you're safe. If it's not that type of situation and it's very hurtful. And I'm going to tell you that I think verbal, if somebody's severe, it is worse than many, things, but nothing's worse than getting hit. But I want to be very mindful of that. It's not okay. It's not okay to hit somebody, hurt somebody, throw things at somebody. It's not okay to say things. It's just not okay. But I want all the women to know that you're not crazy. And men, if this is happening. And I just wanted to bring some light to it, because if it's happening, you need to identify it and you need to change it. And that might mean changing your environment. It might mean changing your relationship status, but it means changing it. Don't take it lightly. Because you're not getting physically abused does not mean you're not being abused. Do not take it lightly. Do not let people gaslight you. Do not let people hurt you. When someone speaks to you in a way that you feel terrible about yourself, no one deserves it. And we need to change it. We need to heal it. So removing yourself from the environment is number one. Your children also do not need to be witness to that. So depending on where you're at in your relationship, your life, or whoever's doing it, number one thing is to remove yourself from that situation immediately and get some help. You're going to need therapy and advice as well. You might be part of the problem. You might have the same thing. You might be verbal as well. You might not be. Please don't blame yourself for someone else's things, and know that if they choose to get help, that's great, but you need to do it in a safe environment. I see way too many people staying in relationships because they think that's their duty while they're getting torn to pieces. That is not what a relationship is. You should be getting built up. You should be getting love. You shouldn't be fearing your partner or fearing what they're going to say to you because something happens. Living in fear is not okay. And it just creates more trauma for you, your children, and their children. And if we want to break generational curses, we have to do the tough stuff. We have to do the work. We have to be accountable. We have to love on those we love who may not be able to be with us any longer, but we still have to give them love. We have to give them grace, to give them understanding. And we have to acknowledge their pain too. Hurt people. They don't just come out of the woodwork and be like, I'm going to hurt you because I feel like hurting you. No, something happened to them. They're hurting. And many people don't even realize the level of anger or pain they have and where it's coming from. And if they can even acknowledge that, that's the first step. Acknowledging it, identifying it, and then working. The hardest part that I see in relationships or in situations is one person doesn't want to see it because they don't want to humble themselves. They don't want to own that they may be wrong or that they may need to work on something. And that's tough. But that's not for you to stay in. I'm not advocating separating or anything. I'm not advocating that. I'm just advocating you need to do what's best for you. You need to remove yourself from the environment, however that is, or remove the person from the environment, even if it's temporary. But there's no reason to sit in trauma. We live in a world that's so beautiful and that has so many opportunities, that has so many resources, that you can sit on a computer and go to a counseling session, that you can set up a Zoom with a partner and go to counseling together without being in the same room. There's ways. We live in an incredible time, a time of healing and removing these curses and removing this trauma. And we just have to be accountable, number one. We have to identify it. We have to be able to take ownership, and we have to do the work. So today I wanted to bring light into this world and tell you that I am a child of trauma. I'm a child of verbal abuse. I've even been the abuser at times. I've used my words to cut. But I choose to no longer do that. I choose to change this. I choose to stop the curses. I choose to change my world and my life for my children so that they can create healthy, beautiful families and generations of love, forgiveness, and humility. So that's all I have for today. This is Shylo Ekstrom out of Duluth, Minnesota. And this is another incredible episode of Grit and Grace. Have an awesome day. All right. So let's do a recap. I love these recaps, Chelsea. I love doing them with you because it's nice to get like that outsider view, kind of that, because I know you said when you were watching this, you're like, oh my God, I wanted to add to it. And I get it because there's so many times where I watch episodes, other people's episodes, and I'm like, oh, I wish I could add to that because I have so much to say on that subject. So I'm excited to do this with you. Obviously, we had a tough episode. So it was really personal. And, I thought I brought some light to it. I want people to be able to have these open communications. And there's a lot of people who are in relationships. It doesn't have to be with a spouse or a partner. It could be a family member or, a friend, but they're in these relationships. And I think sometimes they feel stuck and they don't know how to get out, or they don't know how to find help or a resource with the healing process, I guess
or they're in denial. They're in denial.
Or that. And that's something that I've also dealt with. Like, you go through these stages where you blame yourself, you think you're crazy. And this was something I did multiple times, and I beat myself down so low that it almost is like they win, because even if they're not realizing they're doing it, because I feel that sometimes not everybody knows that they're this way. This is their way of communicating, and this is their way of dealing. And what happens is you take on this role where it's like, okay, you can beat me down, you're going to beat me down, and I'm going to keep going. And then finally you just kind of break, and for me, I go into hiding. So my reaction is usually retreat and hide, and then kind of go down into this weird cocoon where I'm healing and trying to build myself back up, which is really sad. Like, when I think about that, I'm like, that's not healthy, and I should never have to do that. And so I know you have dealt with this type of issue, and what did you want to add to, like, your thoughts on the episode and what you would like to just give your 2 cents on, because I know you have experiences too.
Yeah, for sure. First of all, I think, like, I loved that you used your personal experiences in the episode. And I also love that you're talking about verbal abuse, because I think, and what I said, like they're in denial, I think a huge issue is that, and this comes from people not taking it seriously, or, you know, it's the Me Too movement. It's people not believing them, or things happening and being too afraid because they're, you know, they think they're going to be judged. Or so I think my biggest thing that I love that you talked about is, first of all, it's verbal abuse. It is abuse. It doesn't mean, you know, abuse isn't only a physical thing that you can see. Sometimes the verbal abuse is worse. And, you know, I know many women that like, oh, well, he just grabbed my wrist and it twisted. You know, he's never hit me, or he just threw me up against the wall, but he's never hit me. And, you know, we're talking about physical abuse right now, but that's also denial. That's assuming that physical abuse means you have to leave a mark on my body. And that's not the case. And it's the same thing with verbal abuse. You don't necessarily see the marks on the outside, but it's on the inside. And then that stems into the whole, you know, generational stuff. And that pain becomes anger. And then it's that cycle. It's that constant cycle, because that anger needs to come out somewhere. And then, like you said, you become a verbal abuser almost in a way. Like, it can happen.
Well, you become crazy. You feel like you're crazy because you're sitting there going, wait a minute, this isn't right. Like, you know, something's wrong. You said something really interesting, like it's only the wrist, or he, you know, only this. And we do that in both ways. I've caught myself saying, well, if they do this, then that's crossing the line. No, stop it. To quit creating boundaries there's no boundary on this. Like, there should never be this type of anything. I think we just, because we love somebody, or because it's not, if you didn't care about the person, you'd never allow it, right? Like, we know that it's the people we love the most. So it's like, how do you judge, and where do you draw the line? Well, you draw the line the first time, and that is the hardest thing, because you don't see it. Because what happens is passive aggressive speaking is also very abusive. It can be, and this now goes into with women to women, passive aggressive stuff. I've had people in my life that really hurt me, and like, I didn't know how to handle it, because it wasn't a spouse. It wasn't like, I'm like, how do I deal with this person who needs to be in my life or has to be in my life? And you really have to get some boundaries with people. And if they don't listen, you have to be willing to cut them out. And this has happened to me in multiple relationships where I've had to really walk away. And it's hard, because they're really important people in my life, but they just can't be in my life at that time. Yeah. And sometimes they come back and they're healed. It's crazy. So what you said, like, when it gets to this point, or I think that is something, I played that game, I danced that dance, and you finally get to a point, and then it comes into the anger, where you end up being angry, and then you end up being like snipping back. And of course you're going to get angry and snip back at times. I'm not saying that every time you're mad, or we have
Everyone's
to be
perfect. Nobody gets mad.
Yeah. Like, I mean, we're not talking about minor things or getting upset at times. That's going to happen. But when you get mad and you just puke on somebody, this hatred, where you'd never do it otherwise. It's just like this trigger, or I hate the word trigger, because I think people use it all the time, and I think we need to get over things too. But in this case, it's true. Like, you'll get to a point where you're pushed so far, and then you end up being the abuser back. And then you feel terrible, because you're like, well, now I'm abusive too, you know? And then you start to doubt it, because you're like, well, I said that thing one time. No, this person is still doing it all the time to you. They're knocking you down. So I think it can be a very dangerous dance, because it's so easy to let go, because you just don't want to deal with it.
And before you know it, you've let go so much that it's moved so far, you keep moving your boundaries as they're pushing them. And before you know it, you wake up and you're like, what has happened? What is my life? How do I get out of this? Because now you're too deep. And I think that's also an issue. But one thing I want to bring up about what you were talking about is, you know, it's one thing to be able to cut people out of your life and to recognize that verbal abuse, physical abuse, whether, you know, it's a coworker or a significant other, but when it's your family and you're growing up and this is what you know, right? We learn from our parents, we learn from our environment. That's what we know. That's what we know must be right, right? We assume growing up like that. So, you know, I know you talked about it, but like, how was that for you and moving forward? Like, and what would you recommend to people, I mean, that have kids that maybe have gone through that? Or
It's, you know, it's very challenging because first you have to accept that you're doing it. And I didn't want to accept that I was doing it. It took, and this is where it took my own journey with it happening to me, and then processing it and being honest about it, and then going, but I've done this too, and how have I done it? And then thinking about, and I think healing my daughter and I's relationship, a lot of that's where it came from, is I chose to heal the hardest relationship, hers, and then me and my mother's, which we still, that's a tango as well. But I mean, we're pretty good. Yeah, I'm just saying, like, it's a mother-daughter, and we are, you know, but we are good. And at the same time, I have to say we're good because we can communicate. We still talk. I mean, yes, I get frustrated, I get mad, but it's not screaming, and it's not, you know, but that was the side of the family. It was like my mom and I screamed, and then I would scream at my daughter. I've noticed I've done it to my other kids a few times, and my son had actually pointed it out. It was a couple months ago, and I felt terrible because I don't do it a lot, but when I do it, they notice it. And so when now I'm the person, like, if mom yells, they hate it. Like, they're like, whoa, you know, and obviously if I'm frustrated, they have to also be mindful of me. But it's like, I don't need to yell. And I had to kind of check myself at the door again. It still comes up, but I've chose to accept my side in it. And I think that was the biggest healing moment. But you do need counseling. I think counseling or therapy, you have to have help with a second party that's not involved with you. Like somebody who can guide you in this and also just show you the healthy way of communicating. And listen, I am not perfect. I have moments. I am working. I'm a work in progress, but I feel that with people who have this in their family, and they might be like kind of sitting, maybe they're watching this or listening to this going, well, I do get frustrated when my mom or my dad did this. Do I do this? And be honest about it. And it could have been an aunt or whoever. Could have been a sister or brother. But, or if you've seen it in other parts of the family or around you, this is what you learn. You see it, you learn it, and you think this is how you cope, or this is how you communicate with other people. And it's not. We have to be better. So I think therapy, healers, whatever you can do. And I even brought up, you know, pastor, minister, whoever, you know, whatever your beliefs and systems are, definitely go down that road. But I think it's interesting. I know you had brought up that you have had this happen to you, and you said that you had to remember that it wasn't about you. Let's talk about that, because I think a lot of us have to get to that place. We should never be in the place, but if you're experiencing something, how did you overcome some of that trauma?
I had to find myself again. And, you know, especially a lot of things happen when you're, you know, for you as your family, for me, you know, growing up, everyone has things. They can look back at their parents and the way they react. And it's like, you know, how many times have you heard someone like, oh my gosh, I sound more and more like my mother as I get older or something. But I would say relationship wise, like, I think codependency is a huge issue with people. And especially a lot of people don't, like, surprisingly, still to this day, a lot of people don't understand what that is. And when you become codependent and you become somebody's property, somebody's other half, and that's what you are. You aren't your own person anymore. You're their property. You're who they are. You do what they need done. So because you're afraid you're going to get verbally abused, you make sure that everything is perfect, and it has to be perfect. It has to be perfect. So then you start to have some control issues. This is just stuff that I've experienced. You lose your identity when you walk away from it, But you have to understand that it's, when you love someone, it's hard to walk away. But you need to, for yourself, if there's kids involved, for the kids, because that's what they're witnessing, you just have to get out. And the most important thing for me was like you were talking about counseling. Counseling has been amazing. And you also have to understand at some point, and I've heard you talk about this before, you have to step out of that victim story, because you can get stuck in that cycle. And that's the hardest thing. This is after the fact. This is stepping away from it. This is getting out of it. And you have to take accountability. You have to improve your self-awareness. I think that's so important, your self-awareness. Look inside. We have all these feelings every day, and we don't actually sit and think every time we have a feeling, right? Because the world moves quickly. Why am I feeling this way? Is it because of what that person said? Was what that person said so wrong? Or was it the way that I interpreted it? What's happened in my past and what's happened to me that's causing me to feel this way? And you have to really look at it. And what you're going to find is the places that need to heal. That's what's important. And then from there, it's doing the work, and it's the self-healing. But counseling would be the most important thing, I think, getting out of that, and also understanding that you can't be perfect, and that some kind of healing process. And this is something that someone told me when I first got out of a situation, grief and loss and, all of that. It's not linear. It's not a linear process. You're going to do really well for a couple of weeks, for a couple of months, maybe for a couple of years, but you are going to have setbacks. Things will happen, but you'll have less. And what you need to do is find the tools to use. What helps you? Is it meditation? Is it deep breathing skills? Things like that. And it just, coping mechanisms become easier over time.
I agree. I think everything you said, and the codependency thing it's such a big one, because you become unhealthy. You become unhealthy. It's an unhealthy dependency. And what people don't understand is they confuse it for their role. And I will own this. I had an unhealthy dependency. And when I say that, it's with love, because I watched a mother do it multiple times. We call her Liz Taylor. She's been married quite a few times. I love her, but she had unhealthy relationships, and they were abusive, and that was hard. But some of it, and a lot of that, I should say almost all of them, the ones I witnessed at least, were unhealthy codependency, because you love this person, you go into a role that you up here think is the role, and it allows you to be hurt, because it's this person it's almost like a property. When you say it like that, people get defensive. So when you say, well, I'm not property of anyone. No, but it's the best way to say it.
The way that you're treated.
The way that you're treated is like a property. And so they can treat you the way they want to, because you're theirs.
You allow them to.
And then you allow them to, because you think your role as a spouse or a partner is to be that way, to be complacent, or to, or submissive. Now, this does not mean, when I say that, I'm very much for healthy marriages and healthy partnerships, because I do believe that there's a king and a queen. But when I say that, the king isn't better than the queen, and the queen isn't better than the king. They just have they have roles. Okay. And there's a role for a man and a husband, and the masculine energy. And there's a role for the woman, the wife, and the feminine energy. And they both have to work together. And I think our society has told us different things. And really, if you go way back, that's not what was taught. That's not what was taught. Women were revered in many ways. And it's just like these roles got switched, and it became a lot more negative and like a possession. We're not the possession. And the man isn't. I mean, this can happen another way too. This isn't just women.
Okay? I like how you mentioned that in there. Like
I did mention that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I have witnessed verbal. I've witnessed it. I've witnessed it. Women doing it to men. So
and I've probably done it to men. Like,
yeah, I'm sure I have too. So it's not just one-sided. So I'm really careful when I say that, because it's not. It's just that sometimes I think the roles of society, the old ones, they're changing dramatically as we speak.
Yes.
Man, woman, obviously there's multiple different, it's partnerships. I'll just say partnerships. But I really do see that there's one dominant, when there's one dominant and one submissive, it does always work. It's codependency. Mm-hmm. And now they both can be codependent on each other too. And that's a whole nother deal, but
yes,
it happens. And that's a really big deal. And I'm working on it as we speak, trying to fix some of my things. But, I think we don't like to be accountable sometimes, because saying it out loud about ourselves is painful.
Mm-hmm.
And we feel like failures. I know I have. I know I felt like I'm the problem. I'm the loser. You'll call yourself names and you just put yourself down. And it's like, no, it's just accept it. And it's okay. Like if somebody's on here right now and they're like, wow, maybe I'm verbally abusive, or maybe I'm really verbally harsh. We can say it that way. It doesn't mean that you're destroying people all the time. It just means that you use words in your expression, and depending on how bad those words are, or what you're doing with them, if you're cutting people with them, like sarcasm, it's a form.
Yeah.
It's just owning it. Mm-hmm. It's not about pointing fingers and feeling like a terrible person. It's about owning it, healing it, and fixing it. Mm-hmm. That's it. Like, that's what we have to do. As a society, we've got to stop sitting in it. Yeah. Like you said, no more victims. Don't be a victim. I can't be a victim. And I also can't dwell in my stuff. And I have to remind myself of that every day when I'm having bad days. When you have those setbacks and you're like, wow, I thought I was doing so well. You're like, shit, I was doing so well. And today sucked. It's going to happen.
If they last, they don't last as long. Like, when you had one bad setback day, it would take you out for 2 or 3 weeks. But now, over time, it's like, okay, I had a bad day, but tomorrow, the next day, you wake up and you're ready. Like, you're good.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I thought it was an incredible episode. I loved your feedback. I loved everything that I know your thoughts and everything. And I think it's important to get these types of messages out and open the conversations, because we got to stop not having them. Like, it's okay to talk about this. Oh my God, I've verbally abused too. Like you said, I've done it too. Like, we know that we've probably done it. It doesn't have to be this, oh my God, don't talk about it thing. It needs to be talked about all the time. So when somebody does it, not they're put in a corner and treated like garbage. It's like, wait a minute, this person doesn't properly know how to communicate.
Yeah.
Let's fix it. Let's really fix it. Because it can be fixed. It can be healed. Everything can be. And even when it seems really hopeless. So I wanted to tell everybody that too. Yeah. Any last thoughts for you?
Well, I think it was last week's episode with Megan, or with Monroe. I know she likes to be called that. You guys talked about the healing, and it's giving people grace. I think the name of your podcast is just, it's perfect in that case. I think the whole world, with so many different things that are happening right now, it's giving grace, and it's being aware of what's going on in yourself. But when you give grace to someone else, you hope that, it's the butterfly effect. They're going to go ahead and give grace to someone too. And the understanding, and we kind of slowly start to unravel that anger and release that knot. And then we can truly start to heal.
I love it.
In the future. So
I love it. Well, this is another Inside the Episode with Chelsea and Shylo. I love these. These are fun. These are so much fun. And so we'll catch you on the next one. And I'm excited for the next episode. We've got a couple really good people in lineup, and it's going to be good.
It'll be awesome. All right. Thanks, Shylo.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to and watching Grit and Grace. This episode will be continued next week. Subscribe to us on Spotify or Apple iTunes to listen, and download the Lux TV app to watch anytime, anywhere.
Now, glutathione is a big word, but it's the body's own master antioxidant. So it's a scavenger for free radicals, for bacteria, and what's relevant now, viruses. This is new to the marketplace. There's no other product on the market that has the ingredient NACET.
And basically NACET increases the production of that glutathione that is in our body already to strengthen and enhance our immune system and keep it strong. Elevated sense of well-being. Supports muscle strength and endurance. Cognitive function. Powerful liver support. Energy. Helps blood sugar regulation. Superior bioavailability of key ingredients.
One of your best defenses against COVID is a strong immune system. Taking GSH Plus as a daily supplement does all that. And now we have the product out on the market.